One of the earliest entries into my leadership laboratory was this. The leaders who accelerated weren't always the smartest. They were the ones people trusted before certainty existed. Trust equals competence plus consistency plus vulnerability. Most leaders nail the first two. They lose people on the third. And in the AI era, when your team is watching every decision through the lens of, does this person actually know what they're doing? And do they actually care about us? That third ingredient is the difference between a team that follows you into the hard moments and a team that is quietly updating their LinkedIn. Here's the observation that changed everything for my career. For years, I believed promotions were earned through competence. Work harder, become the expert, know the answer before everyone else. And that's what corporate teaches us. But then I started paying attention, not to the org chart, to the people who everyone gravitated towards, who executives sought out during uncertainty, who boards listened to when no obvious answer existed. And I noticed something that I couldn't unsee. The people with the most influence weren't necessarily the most technically brilliant. They were the people others trusted when outcome was not guaranteed. That observation changed how I think about leadership. And it's one of the earliest entries into now what I call my leadership laboratory. And your career is one long laboratory as well. Every promotion, every difficult boss, every board presentation, every failed project, every reorganization, every uncomfortable conversation. They're all experiments. And most people simply experience them. Some leaders observe them. But the leaders who change industries, build companies, write books, create frameworks, they're the ones paying attention to patterns everyone else dismisses as coincidence. Here's the question that started it. When I first entered corporate America, I assumed influence followed titles. If someone had authority, people trusted them. Simple. Except that's not what I kept seeing. I'd watch executives walk into rooms. Some spoke for 5 minutes and everyone leaned in. Others spoke for an hour and nobody moved. Same title, same intelligence, but completely different influence. So I became curious. Instead of asking what makes someone a better leader, I started asking what makes people believe someone. And that single question became one of the biggest turning points in my career. Because once I started observing instead of assuming, the patterns appeared everywhere. I noticed that trust wasn't emotional. It wasn't charisma. It wasn't confidence. It was built long before the moment people thought trust was being tested. The crisis simply exposed whether trust had already been earned. That's the difference. Trust is built during uncertainty. It's revealed during uncertainty. Today's observation changed my career, and I think it can change yours as well. Trust isn't created after success. People determine already if they trust you before success arrives, and that's two different things. Here's the observation. People trust your thinking long before they trust your decisions. Why? Because if they understand how you think, they can follow you even when they disagree. If they only understand your decisions, they're dependent on outcomes. One creates followers, the other creates believers. That observation eventually became the formula that I want to give you today during our session. So let's talk about the formula and why it's not what you think it is. I didn't wake up and invent a framework. I kept observing leaders over 20 years, and eventually the pattern organized itself into 3 ingredients, simple enough to write on a post-it, but powerful enough to restructure how people lead. Competence plus consistency plus vulnerability equals trust. Let's take each one and dissect them, because each one is doing very different work. Competence is your expertise, your track record, the reason you're in the room. Most leaders have it, but most leaders also assume it's enough. It's not. Competence is the entry fee. It's what gets you the initial trust deposit. It does not keep the account open. Consistency is your reliability. Do you do what you say? Do you show up the same way when it's hard as when it's easy? This is where most leaders lose points without even realizing it. Not in the big moments of failure, but in the small inconsistencies that accumulate. The meeting that got canceled within 10 minutes notice for the 3rd time. The feedback that was promised in Q1 that showed up in Q3. The decision that directly contradicted what you said last quarter with no acknowledgement of the shift. Small things, but they compound. By the time they're visible, you already lost more trust than you realize. Vulnerability is the one thing that changes everything. And it's the one that almost no leadership development program builds for. I want to be very precise here because this word gets used constantly. Vulnerability is a professional context. It's not emotional disclosure. It is not about sharing your childhood traumas in a team meeting. It's not crying in front of your board. It is the willingness to say out loud in front of people, depending on you, I don't have all the answers yet. Here's where I am in the process of getting them. That sentence, done right, builds more trust in 30 seconds than a perfect all-hands presentation builds in 1 hour. Because it gives people something real to respond to instead of a performance to evaluate. And here's the thing about performance. Your team can see it. They're watching you more closely than you know. When your certainty doesn't match the reality of the situation, the gap reads as inauthenticity. And inauthenticity, not failure, not mistakes, is the fastest trust killer that there is. Competence got them into that room. Consistency kept them there. Vulnerability multiplied both. And that's why the framework exists. The framework wasn't the discovery. The observation was. And here's the part most people miss when they hear this for the first time. They hear competence, consistency, vulnerability, and they assume it's additive. Stack enough of each, and you cross some threshold into trust. It is not additive. It's multiplicative. A leader with high competence and high consistency and zero vulnerability doesn't land at pretty trusted. They land at respected, but not followed into the hard moments. I watched this exact profile walk into a room. 15 years of operating experiments. Every number defensible, and still lose the room the second things became uncertain. Because the team had never once seen this person say, I don't know, and actually survive it. So when the moment came that actually required not knowing out loud, there was no precedence for it. The team didn't trust the uncertainty because they'd never been shown what this leader does with the uncertainty. That's the multiplier effect. 0 on any one ingredient doesn't subtract from the total. It caps it. Let's talk about the board that stopped believing before the numbers showed it. I've seen this pattern dozens of times. Different industries, different personalities, different companies, same observation. I want to tell you about a founder I worked with last year, building something genuinely impressive, a technology platform in a space that was moving fast and creating real value for real customers. Revenue growing, team performing. By every external metric, this was a company working on steroids. But his board had started to disengage. Not dramatically, quietly. Questions that used to be curious had started to feel like tests. The check-ins had a different texture to them. He could feel it, but he couldn't exactly name it. And when I started to work with him, I asked him to describe his last 3 presentations. He walked me through them. He had tight narratives, strong data, clear answers to hard questions, polished, professional, compelling. I asked, in any of those presentations, did you tell the board something you were still trying to figure out? He said, no, I need them to have confidence in me. And there it is. He had been managing his board's confidence so carefully that he had stripped out every piece of information that might have given them something real to engage with. He had given them the performance, and boards, especially experienced ones, can tell the difference between a leader who is on top of the situation and a leader who is performing being on top of the situation. What was really happening here? I don't think his board lost confidence because he lacked competence. I think they stopped trusting the performance. People don't follow perfection. They follow consistency. They follow honestly. They follow someone who lets them into the thinking. The fix was not complicated. In his next board meeting, he opened with, I want to start with 3 things I genuinely am uncertain about right now, and I'd like your input before we look at the numbers. That is not a confession. As a diagnostic. As an invitation for the kind of strategic conversation that actually uses a board's experience. His board chair told him afterward it was the best board meeting they had in 2 years. Same company, same challenges, same numbers, different posture. The vulnerability rebuilt what the polish had quietly been eroding. There are distinctly 5 patterns that destroy trust. 5 ways I watch leaders destroy trust during transformation, almost always unintentionally. Almost always fixable once you see them. The first, performative certainty. Leading with confidence you don't actually feel because you're convinced yourself your team needs you to have it together. But here's the problem. Your team can tell. They are watching you in every meeting, in every message, every offhand comment. And when your certainty doesn't match the reality that they're living in, the gap doesn't disappear. It reads as inauthenticity. Number 2, inconsistent decision-making without narration. Making a call 1 week and reversing it 3 weeks later without explaining what new information changed your mind. Your team doesn't expect you to be right every time. They do expect you to be transparent about why you changed course. The reversal alone doesn't destroy trust, but the reversal without context does. 3, feedback avoidance. Knowing a conversation needs to happen with a team member who isn't performing, a stakeholder who crossed the line, a direct report who needs to hear our truth, and not having it. Every week you avoid it. The trust cost compounds. Silence reads as acceptance. And when you finally have the conversation, it comes loaded with 6 months of unsaid things. Both people feel it. Neither fully recovers from that lag. Number 4, stated values that don't match actual consequences. You say you value innovation, but you penalize someone for a failed experiment. You say you prioritize people and run an AI rollout without a single conversation about what it means for the team's day-to-day experience. You say you value feedback and visibly freeze when you get something critical. People do not believe what you say. They believe what you do when doing the right thing costs you something. Full stop. 5, and this is the one that I see most often with senior, high-performing leaders specifically. Borrowed certainty. This is when a leader doesn't actually feel sure, but adopts the language of someone above them, a CEO, a board, an industry voice that they admire, and repeats it as if it were their own conviction. We're not worried about that, when in fact they are worried about that. This is the right call, when privately they're still weighing it. Borrowed certainty is seductive because it feels responsible. It feels like leadership. But your team can hear the difference between a sentence that came from your own thinking and a sentence that came from somewhere else and got relayed. The first builds trust in your judgment. The second quietly tells your team you don't fully trust your own judgment either. You just didn't want to say so. These 5 patterns rarely show up as one dramatic failure. They show up as residue, a little bit each week in meetings nobody flags as significant, until one day the team's behavior has changed and nobody can point to the moment it happened. Here's something I don't think enough leaders admit. We're terrified that if people see uncertainty, they'll question our capability. But I've found the opposite. People rarely lose confidence because leaders admit uncertainty. They lose confidence because leaders pretend certainty while everyone else already knows uncertainty exists. Those are 2 completely different experiences. One builds credibility, one destroys it completely. But I want to go a layer deeper than that, because I think we let leaders off too easy when we frame this as a purely personal failing. Most of the trust problems I see are not actually about the leaders. They're about the environments the leaders are operating in. Think about that. We ask leaders to be vulnerable in organizations that punish uncertainty. We ask them to model psychological safety in cultures that reward people who have it together. We ask them to admit what they don't know in rooms where not knowing is treated as a performance gap. And then we wonder why the trust formula breaks down. Vulnerability requires safety, not just the safety to be vulnerable down with your team, but with your direct reports, but up with your board, with your CEO. If the system you're operating in makes it expensive to say, I don't have all the answers, then the formula is broken at the system level, not the individual level. This is why I always ask in our first coaching session, who does this leader get to be uncertain with? Who holds the space for them not to know? Almost universally, the answer is nobody. And that gap between what leaders are asked to give and what they are given to work with is one of the most expensive, invisible costs within any organization. Let's define trust at scale in 3 systems. Here's where it gets structurally harder. When you're leading an organization, not just a team, you cannot build trust one relationship at a time. You need systems that generate it at scale. Here are 3. Narrative transparency, a regular communication rhythm, not a newsletter, not a slide deck, where you tell the organization where you actually are, not just the results, the process. Here's what we're working on. Here's what's harder than we expected. Here's the decision I'm sitting with right now that doesn't have an obvious right answer. Here's what I'm protecting while everything else moves. Done consistently, every 2 weeks, every month, whatever cadence your org can sustain. This becomes the most powerful trust-building mechanism in your toolkit because people don't need certainty from their leaders. They need honesty, and honesty delivered consistently builds more loyalty than any result. I worked with a leadership team that started doing this monthly in writing before any all hands. 3 paragraphs. What we're confident about, what we're not, what we're watching. They told me 6 months in that the thing that changed wasn't morale exactly. It was speed. People stopped spending energy trying to read the tea leaves and started spending it on actual work. The uncertainty hadn't gone away. The guessing had. Protected psychological safety. This isn't about being an HR initiative. This is a specific behavior, rewarding honest resistance publicly and visibly. The next time someone in a meeting says, "I don't think this is working," do not explain why they're wrong. Do not redirect to the positive. Say thank you out loud in front of the room. Thank them for saying what is true and possibly uncomfortable. That one moment, witnessed by everyone in the room, does more for psychological safety than 6 months of training. Because it proves that telling the truth in this organization is rewarded, not penalized. Human amplifier moments. One deliberate decision per month that you make in a way that signals, I know the difference between what can be automated and what shouldn't be. A hiring decision you take personally instead of delegating to a process. A client relationship call you get on instead of sending a summary. A performance conversation you have in person instead of over Slack. These moments are not inefficiencies. They are investments in the human infrastructure that makes everything else possible. And your team is watching whether you specifically make them. Here's where I think leadership is changing. For decades, leaders were rewarded for certainty. Today, leaders are rewarded for interpretation. AI gives us the information. Leadership gives it meaning. That's why trust matters more today than it did 10 years ago, not less, because certainty is becoming automated. Meaning isn't. Most organizations are measuring the wrong thing and wondering why trust erodes. Engagement surveys, NPS scores, retention rates, these are lagging indicators. By the time they show up in your data, the trust has already been gone for months. The leading indicator of trust is one question. Do people bring you the real problems? Not the polished ones. Not the problems with solutions already attached. The messy, uncomfortable, career-risking to admit problems. If those problems are landing in your meeting rooms, congratulations, you have trust. If they're happening on the parking lot or on Slack after hours, if conversations you're not a part of, trust has already failed. And no survey will catch that in time. This week, don't ask yourself, do people trust me? Ask yourself something much harder. What observations have I been making about leadership that nobody else around me seems to notice? Write one down. Start your own leadership laboratory. Because someday that observation may just become your framework, your book, your company, your career. Mine certainly did. Then score yourself on the formula. Competence. Do you have the track record that earns credibility in this specific moment? Consistency. Have you done what you said you would do in the last 90 days? Vulnerability. When is the last time you said out loud in front of your team that you were still figuring something out? If your lowest score is vulnerability, and it almost always is, your assignment is one sentence. In your next team meeting, say this: there's one thing I'm navigating right now I don't have a clean answer to yet. Here's what I'm thinking. And then say that thing. Tell me in the comments what happened when you said it. I want to hear from you. What I want to leave you with today through this session. One observation. It changed how I viewed trust forever. The next observation changed how I viewed energy within organizations. And that's what we'll get into next time. Until then, pay attention. Leadership leaves cues. The question isn't whether they're there. It's whether you're observing them.